What if the very people who should love you unconditionally decided instead that you were too shameful to exist? On a cold February morning in 1939, in the rolling hills of rural Tennessee, Martha Callahan gave birth to twins who would never see sunlight, never attend school, never speak to another human being outside their immediate family. Some families keep skeletons in closets. The Callahans kept theirs alive, in the barn. This isn't just a story about neglect or abuse. This is about a systematic erasure of human existence, a 40-year conspiracy of silence that turned blood relatives into prison wardens. The Callahan twins weren't just hidden from society, they were denied the very concept of society itself. If you believe that every human being deserves dignity, that every child deserves protection, then what I'm about to share will shake you to your core. By subscribing to Shadow Stories, you're not just watching true crime content, you're bearing witness to the forgotten, giving voice to those who were silenced. Hit that subscribe button and join me in pulling back the curtain on America's darkest family secrets. Picture rural Tennessee in 1939, a landscape where church bells still dictated the rhythm of life and family reputation meant everything. The Great Depression had taught communities to mind their own business and ask few questions, especially when it came to what happened behind closed doors. In this world of unspoken rules and careful distances, the Callahan farm sat like a fortress of secrets on the outskirts of Millfield, Tennessee. The property sprawled across 80 acres of tobacco fields and pasture land, bordered by dense woods that seemed to swallow sound and light. The main farmhouse, a two-story structure painted white but perpetually stained with the red clay that clung to everything in that part of the state, faced the road with windows that always seemed to be watching. But it was the barn, a massive, weather-beaten structure painted blood red and positioned far from both the house and the road, that would become the center of the Callahan family's most horrifying secret. This was an era when physical deformities were seen as divine punishment, when families routinely institutionalized or abandoned children who didn't fit society's narrow definition of acceptable. Mental hospitals were overcrowded snake pits, and the emerging field of eugenics preached that some bloodlines were simply cursed. In this climate of fear and superstition, a family could make someone disappear without raising too many questions, especially if that someone had never officially existed in the first place. Jeremiah Callahan was the kind of man who commanded respect through fear rather than admiration, a patriarch whose word was absolute law on his property and whose temper was legendary throughout 3 counties. Standing 6 feet 4 inches tall with hands like sledgehammers and eyes the color of winter storm clouds, he had built his reputation on 2 foundations: his ability to work harder than any 3 men combined, and his willingness to use violence to solve problems that talking couldn't fix. Those who knew him described a man who spoke in growls rather than sentences, who could break a horse or a man's spirit with equal efficiency. He had married Martha Henley in 1935, a pale, bird-like woman from a neighboring farm who brought with her a dowry of silence and submission. Martha was known for her ability to disappear into the background of any room, to make herself small and unnoticed, a skill that would serve her well in the years to come. Jeremiah's reputation for brutality wasn't just rural legend, it was a documented fact. Local law enforcement had been called to the Callahan farm twice in the early years of his marriage, once for a farmhand who claimed Jeremiah had beaten him unconscious with a shovel handle, and once for a suspected case of domestic violence that Martha refused to confirm. Both times the charges were dropped, partly due to lack of evidence, but mostly because witnesses had a habit of changing their minds about testifying against Jeremiah Callahan. The man didn't just demand respect, he harvested fear like a crop, and fear, as everyone in Millfield knew, was more reliable than justice. To the outside world, the Callahans ran a model operation, a thriving tobacco farm that employed a dozen seasonal workers and provided steady income to the local economy. Jeremiah had positioned himself as a progressive farmer, one of the first in the county to invest in modern equipment and scientific farming techniques. He served on the local agricultural board, attended church regularly, and made generous donations to community causes. The farm's success story was one that local newspapers loved to feature. The hard-working patriarch who had transformed marginal land into a profitable enterprise through determination and innovation. Martha, meanwhile, maintained a perfect image as the dutiful farm wife, known throughout the community for her canned preserves and her skill with traditional crafts. She rarely spoke in public, but when she did, it was always to praise her husband's business acumen or to deflect attention from herself. The Callahan farm was featured in agricultural journals as an example of how modern farming techniques could revive rural communities, and Jeremiah was frequently invited to speak at county fairs and farmers' meetings. This public success created a shield of respectability that would prove crucial in the years to come. After all, who would suspect a pillar of the community of harboring such a monstrous secret? The very success of their legitimate business made their crimes not just possible, but invisible. The barn that would become a prison was an architectural marvel in its own right, built by Jeremiah himself over the course of 2 years, using lumber he had harvested from his own property. From the outside, it appeared to be exactly what it claimed to be, a functional agricultural building designed to store equipment, process tobacco, and house livestock during harsh weather. The structure measured 60 feet long by 40 feet wide, with a peaked roof that rose 30 feet at its highest point. The walls were constructed from thick oak planks, sealed against the elements, and reinforced with steel brackets that Jeremiah had salvaged from a demolished railway bridge. But inside, the barn told a different story entirely. The main floor was divided into traditional livestock stalls and equipment storage, but beneath the hay-covered floorboards lay a hidden basement that Jeremiah had excavated in secret during the winter months of 1938. This subterranean chamber, accessible only through a concealed trapdoor hidden beneath a pile of feed sacks, measured 20 feet by 30 feet and was lined with the same stone that formed the foundation of the main farmhouse. The walls wept moisture year-round, creating an atmosphere that was perpetually damp and cold, filled with the smell of mold and decay that would become the defining sensory memory for anyone who entered that cursed space. The only light came from a single kerosene lamp that cast dancing shadows on the stone walls, creating an environment that existed somewhere between cellar and crypt. When neighbors or visitors noticed the unusual security measures surrounding the barn, the heavy padlocks, the reinforced doors, the way Jeremiah always seemed to appear whenever someone got too close, he had ready explanations that seemed perfectly reasonable. The locks, he claimed, were necessary to protect expensive farming equipment from theft, pointing to a recent rash of burglaries that had struck other farms in the county. The reinforced construction was simply good business sense, he argued, designed to protect his investment from fire, flood, and the violent storms that regularly swept through Tennessee. When people commented on the strange sounds that sometimes emanated from the building, thuds, scraping noises, and what sounded like muffled voices, Jeremiah explained that he was experimenting with new livestock breeding techniques and that the sounds were simply animals adjusting to their new environment. He even invited a few trusted neighbors to tour the main floor of the barn, showing off his collection of modern farming equipment and his prize breeding stock, always careful to schedule these visits during daylight hours when the sounds from below would be masked by the activity above. The scientific jargon he had picked up from agricultural journals served him well during these explanations, allowing him to sound authoritative and progressive while simultaneously deflecting deeper questions. His reputation as an innovative farmer made these explanations not just plausible, but impressive to a community that respected hard work and forward thinking. Dr. Samuel Wickham was the kind of man who believed that science could solve any problem and that progress required difficult choices even when those choices challenged traditional morality. A graduate of Vanderbilt University's medical school who had returned to rural Tennessee to serve his community, he brought with him the latest theories about genetics, eugenics, and what he termed biological optimization. Dr. Wickham had been present at the birth of the Callahan twins, and it was his professional opinion that shaped what would become 4 decades of imprisonment and suffering. He was a respected figure in Millfield, known for his modern medical practices and his willingness to discuss the latest scientific discoveries with anyone who would listen. But behind his professional demeanor lurked a man who had become intoxicated with the power to determine who deserved to live normal lives and who should be hidden away for the greater good of society. When Martha Callahan went into labor on that February night in 1939, Dr. Wickham arrived expecting a routine delivery. What he found instead were twins whose physical deformities were so severe that he immediately declared them incompatible with normal social integration. His recommendation to Jeremiah was swift and decisive. These children should be kept hidden from society, not out of cruelty, but out of compassion for a community that wasn't ready to accept such genetic anomalies. Dr. Wickham's involvement didn't end with the delivery. He became the twins' only medical care provider, making monthly visits to the farm to monitor their health and to help maintain the fiction that they had died in infancy. The twins, who would live their entire lives without official names, referred to only as the boy and the girl in the few documents that acknowledged their existence, represented a collision between genetic misfortune and societal rejection that would define their entire existence. Born at the tail end of a difficult pregnancy that had left Martha bedridden for weeks, they arrived in the world already marked by the physical abnormalities that would seal their fate. The boy was born with what medical professionals would later identify as severe spina bifida and cranial deformities that left his skull misshapen and his cognitive development significantly impaired. His sister suffered from a combination of skeletal abnormalities and muscular dystrophy that twisted her limbs into positions that made normal movement impossible. But beyond their physical challenges, these children possessed something that their captors never expected and never acknowledged: consciousness, curiosity, and an unbreakable bond with each other that would sustain them through decades of isolation. In the brief moments when they were allowed above ground, neighbors reported seeing two figures moving awkwardly around the barn's exterior, always under the watchful supervision of either Jeremiah or Martha. These glimpses were rare and quickly explained away, but they planted seeds of curiosity that would eventually grow into suspicion. The twins developed their own language, a combination of gestures and sounds that allowed them to communicate complex thoughts and emotions to each other, even when words were forbidden. They created games using scraps of fabric and pieces of broken equipment, built imaginary worlds in the corners of their stone prison, and somehow maintained their sanity despite conditions that would have broken most adult minds. Mary Catherine Sullivan was not looking for trouble when she took the job as a seasonal worker at the Callahan farm in the autumn of 1943, but trouble, as she would later reflect, has a way of finding those who pay attention to details that others prefer to ignore. A 23-year-old woman from a neighboring county who needed work to support her aging parents, Mary Catherine was known for her fierce work ethic and her tendency to ask questions when things didn't make sense. She had been hired to help with the tobacco harvest, a temporary position that should have lasted 6 weeks at most, but Jeremiah had been impressed enough with her work to offer her a permanent position, helping Martha with household duties and general farm maintenance. What made Mary Catherine different from the other workers was her habit of arriving early and staying late, her curiosity about every aspect of the farming operation, and her complete inability to mind her own business when something struck her as odd. It was this combination of traits that led her to be working alone in the main barn on a cold October evening when she heard something that would haunt her for the rest of her life: the sound of children singing. The melody was unfamiliar, the words were unintelligible, but the voices were unmistakably human and unmistakably young. When she investigated the source of the sound, tracing it to what appeared to be a solid section of flooring near the back of the barn, she discovered that the boards beneath the feed sacks were loose and that air and sound was moving through the gaps. Mary Catherine had stumbled upon the existence of the twins, and though she didn't yet understand what she had found, she knew instinctively that she had discovered something that was never meant to be discovered. The aftermath of Mary Catherine's discovery was swift and brutal, a demonstration of the lengths to which the Callahan family would go to protect their secret and the price that would be paid by anyone who threatened to expose it. When Jeremiah found her the next morning, kneeling by the loose floorboards with her ear pressed to the gap, listening to the sounds from below, his reaction was immediate and violent. Mary Catherine later described the beating she received as the most terrifying experience of her life, not just because of the physical pain, but because of the look in Jeremiah's eyes. A cold, calculating expression that made it clear he was deciding whether she would leave the barn alive. The threats that followed were specific and detailed. If she spoke to anyone about what she had heard, he would make sure that she and her family suffered consequences that would make death seem like mercy. But Jeremiah's mistake was in assuming that fear would be enough to ensure Mary Catherine's silence. Instead, the beating and the threats only convinced her that whatever was hidden beneath the barn floor was worth killing to protect, which meant it was worth risking her life to expose. She left the Callahan farm that same day, officially terminated for unspecified behavioral problems. But she didn't leave Millfield. Instead, she took a job at the general store in town and began the careful process of gathering information, asking subtle questions, and building a case that would eventually crack open the Callahan family's most carefully guarded secret. Mary Catherine had become the first person outside the family to suspect the truth. But she was smart enough to know that suspicion without proof was just another word for gossip, and gossip wouldn't save whoever was trapped beneath that barn floor. The first official inquiry into the Callahan farm came in the spring of 1945, triggered not by Mary Catherine's suspicions, but by a bureaucratic accident that threatened to expose the twins' existence through the simple act of counting. The Tennessee Department of Health had begun conducting a comprehensive census of rural populations as part of a post-war public health initiative, and Millfield had been selected as a pilot community for the new program. The census workers, armed with detailed forms and specific instructions to account for every resident in their assigned territory, arrived at the Callahan farm on a Tuesday morning in April, expecting to conduct a routine interview with a farm family. What they found instead was a carefully rehearsed performance designed to deflect attention from the family's true composition. Jeremiah presented himself as the sole adult male resident, Martha as his wife, and together they claimed to have no living children, explaining that they had suffered the tragic loss of twins in infancy, a story that Dr. Wickham was prepared to corroborate with falsified medical records if necessary. The census workers accepted this explanation without question, but the process had created an official document that established the twins as deceased, a fiction that would require ongoing maintenance and careful coordination between multiple parties. The inquiry itself was brief and superficial, but its existence created a paper trail that future investigators would eventually use to unravel the entire conspiracy. More importantly, the census process had forced the Callahans to actively lie to government officials, escalating their crime from private family matter to federal deception and setting the stage for charges that would carry serious legal consequences. By 1950, the twins had spent 11 years in captivity, and their imprisonment had begun to leave visible marks on their captors as well as their victims, creating a household dynamic that was equal parts prison and asylum. Martha had developed what Dr. Wickham privately diagnosed as severe depression and anxiety, conditions that manifested in obsessive cleaning behaviors, violent mood swings, and extended periods during which she would speak to no one, including her husband. She had become the twins' primary caregiver by default, spending hours each day in the basement chamber, feeding them, cleaning their improvised living space, and monitoring their physical and emotional deterioration. The psychological toll of this daily routine had transformed her from the quiet, submissive farm wife she had once been into something approaching a psychiatric patient herself, a woman who talked to herself constantly and who jumped at unexpected sounds. Jeremiah, meanwhile, had become increasingly paranoid and violent, convinced that every visitor to the farm was a potential threat to their secret, and that every casual conversation might contain hidden attempts to gather intelligence about his family. The twins themselves had grown from helpless infants into adolescents whose physical deformities had worsened with age, but whose mental capabilities had developed in ways that their captors found both surprising and troubling. They had learned to read using discarded newspapers and magazine pages that Martha smuggled to them, had developed sophisticated strategies for hiding their activities when footsteps approached their prison, and had begun to ask questions about the world beyond the barn that neither Martha nor Jeremiah could adequately answer. The dynamic had evolved into something resembling a Cold War, with each side maintaining careful surveillance of the other and preparing for a conflict that everyone knew was inevitable. The methodology behind the Callahan family's 40-year deception was a masterwork of systematic cruelty disguised as protective care, a daily routine that had evolved over time into a comprehensive system for erasing human existence while maintaining the pretense of normalcy. Each morning before dawn, Martha would make her way to the barn carrying a basket containing the twins' daily ration of food, usually leftovers from the family's meals, supplemented with bread and milk that she claimed was intended for the farm's cats. The feeding process required her to move the heavy feed sacks that concealed the trapdoor, descend into the basement chamber using a rope ladder that Jeremiah had installed for her safety, and spend approximately 30 minutes distributing food, emptying the crude sanitation system that served as the twins' only toilet, and conducting a basic health assessment that she would later report to Dr. Wickham. The basement itself had been equipped with the minimum amenities necessary to sustain human life: straw-filled mattresses that were replaced seasonally, wooden buckets for waste disposal, and a ventilation system that Jeremiah had ingeniously connected to the barn's main air circulation system, ensuring that fresh air reached the chamber without creating obvious evidence of habitation. The twins' clothing consisted of simple cotton garments that Martha sewed herself, designed for durability rather than comfort, and replaced only when they became too worn or soiled to serve their purpose. During the winter months, their only source of heat was their shared body warmth and a collection of old blankets that Martha had salvaged from the main house, creating conditions that were barely adequate to prevent death but insufficient to ensure comfort or health. Thomas Mitchell was exactly the kind of man who should never have stumbled upon the Callahan family's secret, but fate has a perverse sense of humor when it comes to matching investigators with mysteries. A reporter for the Nashville Banner, who had been assigned to write a series of human interest stories about successful rural farming operations, Mitchell arrived in Millfield in the summer of 1962 with no agenda beyond producing feel-good content about American agricultural ingenuity. He was 43 years old, a veteran journalist who had covered everything from political corruption to natural disasters, but who had specifically requested assignment to lighter stories after a particularly brutal year covering civil rights violence in Mississippi. The relentless tension of those assignments, witnessing tear gas clouds, fire hoses, and snarling dogs turned on peaceful protesters, had left him craving the simplicity of stories about hard work and honest triumph. Mitchell's approach to journalism was methodical and thorough. He believed that every story had layers beneath its surface, and that the best human interest pieces came from understanding not just what people did, but why they did it, and how their personal histories had shaped their current circumstances. When he arrived at the Callahan farm, he expected to spend a pleasant afternoon interviewing a successful farmer and his wife about their rise from Depression-era poverty to agricultural prosperity. He pictured a sunlit porch, a pitcher of lemonade, and tales of grit and ingenuity overcoming hardship. What he found instead was a family whose carefully constructed public image contained gaps and inconsistencies that his trained eye couldn't ignore. Jeremiah Callahan's answers to basic questions about his farming operation were too rehearsed, too perfect, as if he had spent years preparing for exactly these questions. His account of crop yields and innovative irrigation techniques sounded like a memorized script, delivered with a practiced smile that never reached his eyes. Martha's behavior was even more troubling. She seemed terrified of her own husband, flinched at unexpected sounds, and displayed the kind of hypervigilance that Mitchell had previously observed only in combat veterans and abuse survivors. Her hands trembled slightly as she poured coffee, and her eyes darted toward Jeremiah whenever he spoke, as if gauging his mood. Most disturbing of all was the barn itself, which Jeremiah refused to allow him to enter, claiming that it contained proprietary equipment that competitors might copy if photographed for the newspaper. The excuse felt flimsy. Mitchell had toured countless farms, and proprietary equipment was rarely a concern. The barn's heavy padlock and the faint, unplaceable odor lingering near its doors only deepened his suspicion. Something was off, and Mitchell's instinct, honed by years of chasing truth, told him the Callahans were hiding more than innovative machinery. Mitchell's investigation began as a simple journalistic curiosity, but it evolved over the course of several months into an obsession that would ultimately consume his career and reshape his understanding of human evil. His first step was to return to Nashville and conduct research into the Callahan family's background, using the Nashville Banner's extensive archives and his network of contacts throughout Tennessee to piece together their history. What he discovered was a pattern of carefully managed public relations that stretched back more than 2 decades, supported by testimonials from local officials, agricultural experts, and community leaders who all seemed to be reading from the same script when they praised the family's contributions to the region. Their endorsements were polished, almost rehearsed, lauding the Callahans' innovations in crop rotation and community charity with an eerie uniformity. But Mitchell also found gaps in the narrative, periods during the 1940s and 1950s when the Callahans had avoided public appearances, declined interviews, and generally maintained a much lower profile than their supposed success would warrant. These absences were peculiar for a family celebrated as local heroes, and they nagged at Mitchell's instincts. More troubling still were the subtle inconsistencies in their story. Medical records that didn't quite align with their claims about a family tragedy, a supposed stillbirth that lacked corroborating hospital documentation, financial documents that suggested income sources beyond their legitimate farming operation, including unexplained cash deposits in years when harvests were poor, and a pattern of employee turnover that seemed unusually high for a supposedly well-managed agricultural business. Workers stayed for months, not years, and none seemed willing to talk about their time at the farm. Mitchell's breakthrough came when he located Mary Catherine Sullivan, now married and living in Kentucky, who had spent nearly 20 years wondering if anyone would ever ask her about her brief employment at the Callahan farm. Her story about the sounds beneath the barn floor, muffled, irregular noises she described as like someone tapping for help, provided Mitchell with the first concrete evidence that something sinister was happening at the farm. Her account was vivid, chilling, and delivered with the quiet certainty of someone who had carried a burden too long, yet it also made him realize that he was pursuing a story that could destroy lives, including his own, if he made a mistake in his investigation or his reporting. The weight of her testimony pressed on him, forcing him to confront the possibility that the Callahans' meticulously crafted facade hid a darkness far worse than he had imagined, one that could unravel not just their lives, but the entire community's trust in its own history. Okay, let's pause. If you've made it this far, you're as deep in this as I am. The Callahan family's secret had remained hidden for over 2 decades, protected by fear, carefully constructed lies, and a community's willingness to look the other way when something didn't seem quite right. But now Thomas Mitchell had found the thread that, when pulled, would unravel the entire conspiracy. If you're finding this story as important as I do, please consider sharing it. Let's get more eyes on this story of forgotten victims and the people who fought to give them justice. The evidence that would finally expose the Callahan twins came not from Mitchell's investigation, but from an unexpected source that demonstrated how even the most carefully planned conspiracies can be undone by simple human error and technological progress. In the winter of 1963, the Rural Electrification Administration had begun installing power lines throughout remote areas of Tennessee, and the Callahan farm had been selected as a priority location due to Jeremiah's political connections and his status as a model agricultural business. The electrical survey required engineers to conduct ground-penetrating surveys to locate the optimal routes for power lines and to identify any subsurface obstacles that might interfere with installation. When the survey team arrived at the Callahan property, they were given full access to conduct their technical assessments, with Jeremiah confident that his secret was buried too deep to be detected by routine electrical planning. But the new electromagnetic detection equipment that the engineers were using was more sensitive than anyone had anticipated, and it clearly showed the existence of a large hollow space beneath the barn floor, a space that was not only occupied, but was generating heat signatures consistent with human habitation. The survey team's report, filed as a routine technical document, contained detailed measurements and electromagnetic readings that proved conclusively that the barn contained a hidden chamber with living occupants. This evidence was exactly what Mitchell had been searching for, official technical proof that could not be dismissed as gossip or speculation, documented by government engineers who had no connection to the Callahan family and no reason to falsify their findings. When Mitchell finally obtained copies of the electromagnetic survey through a contact at the Rural Electrification Administration, he knew that he had found the smoking gun that would crack the case wide open, but he also knew that presenting this evidence to the authorities would trigger a chain of events that could endanger whatever victims were hidden beneath the Callahan barn. His decision to contact law enforcement rather than publish his story immediately was one that he would later describe as the most difficult of his career. Every instinct he had developed as a journalist told him to break the story first and let others deal with the consequences, but his conscience told him that this situation required immediate intervention to protect potential victims. Mitchell's first call was to the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation, where he was connected with Agent Robert Castellanos, a 15-year veteran of criminal investigations who specialized in cases involving organized crime and conspiracy. Castellanos initially dismissed Mitchell's story as the product of an overactive imagination, but the electromagnetic survey data was too compelling to ignore, and within 24 hours he had obtained a warrant to search the Callahan property. The legal process moved with unusual speed, partly because of the technical evidence, but mostly because Dr. Wickham, now nearing retirement and increasingly concerned about his own legal liability, had begun cooperating with investigators in exchange for immunity from prosecution. The stage was set for a confrontation that had been 24 years in the making, a moment when carefully constructed lies would finally collide with undeniable truth. The raid on the Callahan farm took place on March 15, 1964, beginning before dawn with a coordinated operation involving agents from the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation, officers from the local sheriff's department, medical personnel from the state health department, and social workers trained to handle extreme cases of child abuse and neglect. Agent Castellanos had planned the operation with military precision, knowing that they would have only one opportunity to gather evidence before the Callahan family's lawyers could intervene and potentially destroy crucial proof of their crimes. The agents approached the property in unmarked vehicles, moving silently through the pre-dawn mist, surrounding the farmhouse and barn simultaneously to prevent anyone from escaping or destroying evidence. When they broke down the barn door and located the hidden trapdoor beneath a pile of feed sacks, nothing could have prepared them for what they found in that stone chamber 25 feet below ground. The twins, now 25 years old, but with the physical development of malnourished adolescents, were discovered huddled together on a pile of moldy straw, their bodies twisted by decades of inadequate nutrition and lack of proper medical care, their eyes squinting against the flashlight beams that represented the first strong light they had ever experienced. Their skeletal frames and hollow cheeks spoke of a life deprived of sustenance, their skin pale and marred by sores from prolonged confinement. The chamber itself was a monument to systematic neglect. The walls were covered with crude drawings that the twins had scratched into the stone using pieces of metal salvaged from their food containers, depicting fragmented scenes of a world they had never seen, trees, stars, and faces they could only imagine. The air was thick with the smell of human waste and decay. A stifling miasma, too, had forced some agents to cover their faces as they descended. The floor was littered with decades of accumulated debris, rusted cans, tattered cloth, and brittle bones of small animals that told the story of their captivity in heartbreaking detail. But perhaps most shocking of all was the evidence of the twins' intelligence and creativity. They had created a complex written language using symbols carved into the chamber walls, a lexicon of their own making that hinted at a desperate need to communicate. They had constructed elaborate sculptures from scraps of fabric and wood, delicate and intricate despite their crude materials, and had developed sophisticated methods for tracking the passage of time despite having no access to clocks or calendars, using patterns of scratches to mark days and seasons. These artifacts of resilience stood in stark contrast to the horror of their imprisonment, revealing minds that had fought to preserve their humanity against unimaginable odds. The public reaction to the discovery of the Callahan twins was immediate and explosive, generating newspaper headlines across the nation and sparking a media frenzy that would continue for months as additional details of their captivity emerged. The initial reports, based on information provided by law enforcement officials and medical personnel who had examined the twins, described conditions so shocking that many readers initially dismissed them as sensationalized fiction designed to sell newspapers. But as photographs of the basement chamber were released and as medical reports detailing the twins' physical and psychological condition became public, the full scope of the Callahan family's crimes became undeniable. Editorial writers struggled to find adequate language to describe what had been done to these victims, with many settling on comparisons to the Nazi concentration camps that had been liberated less than 20 years earlier. The legal proceedings moved forward with unusual speed, partly because of the overwhelming evidence, but mostly because public outrage demanded swift justice for crimes that seemed to challenge the basic assumptions of civilized society. Jeremiah and Martha Callahan were arrested and charged with multiple counts of false imprisonment, child abuse, conspiracy to commit fraud, and violation of federal civil rights statutes. Dr. Wickham was also arrested, though his cooperation with investigators eventually led to a plea agreement that many observers considered insufficiently harsh given his role in perpetuating the conspiracy. The trials became a media spectacle, with reporters from across the country descending on Millfield to cover proceedings that would ultimately result in life sentences for both Jeremiah and Martha Callahan. As investigators delved deeper into the Callahan family's background and financial records, they uncovered evidence of a conspiracy that extended far beyond the abuse of the twins, involving a network of complicit individuals and institutions that had helped maintain the family's facade of respectability for more than 2 decades. The financial investigation revealed that Dr. Wickham had been receiving monthly payments from Jeremiah Callahan since 1939, ostensibly for medical services, but actually for his silence and cooperation in maintaining the fiction that the twins had died in infancy. These transactions, meticulously recorded in ledgers hidden in the farmhouse attic, showed a pattern of hush money disguised as professional fees. Bank records showed similar payments to local officials, including a county clerk who had helped falsify birth and death certificates, ensuring no trace of the twins existed in public records, and a social worker who had filed false reports claiming to have investigated the family's circumstances, her signatures on documents riddled with inconsistencies that had gone unquestioned. The investigation also uncovered evidence that the Callahan farm had been used as a way station for other criminal activities, including the trafficking of stolen goods, everything from bootlegged liquor to stolen machinery, and the harboring of fugitives from justice who were hidden in outbuildings for days or weeks at a time. The family's isolation, coupled with their reputation for violence, had made them valuable partners for various criminal enterprises who relied on the Callahans' ability to deter scrutiny with their carefully crafted image of rural success. Most disturbing of all was the discovery that the twins' case was not unique. Investigators found evidence of at least 3 other families in Tennessee and neighboring states who had received advice of and assistance from Dr. Wickham in hiding disabled or deformed children from public view, creating a network of family-based concentration camps that had operated with impunity for decades. These families, linked through cryptic correspondence and shared contacts, had followed similar patterns: falsified records, isolated properties, and a veneer of respectability upheld by bribes and intimidation. The full scope of this conspiracy would never be completely mapped, as many of the participants had died or disappeared by the time investigators began their work, their secrets buried in unmarked graves or burned in hastily destroyed documents. Yet the evidence suggested that the systematic abuse of vulnerable individuals had been far more widespread than anyone had previously imagined. A chilling web of complicity that stretched across rural communities, protected by silence and the willingness of those in power to look the other way in exchange for profit or convenience. The conspiracy of silence that had protected the Callahan family for so long was not simply a matter of individual cowardice or indifference, but rather the product of social, cultural, and institutional forces that made the twins' abuse not just possible but inevitable. The 1940s and 1950s were an era when physical and mental disabilities were seen as sources of family shame rather than medical conditions requiring treatment and support, when the concept of individual rights for disabled persons was virtually non-existent. and when institutions routinely warehoused inconvenient people in conditions that differed from the Callahan basement, primarily in scale rather than substance. Families were encouraged to hide such defects to preserve their social standing, and communities often colluded in this secrecy, viewing it as a grim necessity. The medical establishment of the time, influenced by eugenics theories that portrayed certain genetic conditions as threats to the purity of the human race, often recommended that disabled children be removed from their families and placed in institutions where they would be hidden from public view and prevented from reproducing. Dr. Wickham's advice to hide the twins was not an aberration, but rather a reflection of mainstream medical opinion that saw such children as burdens to be managed rather than human beings deserving of care and dignity. His notes, uncovered during the investigation, chillingly referred to the twins as unviable stock, a term borrowed from livestock management, revealing the dehumanizing lens through which he operated. The legal system, meanwhile, provided virtually no protection for victims of family-based abuse, operating on the assumption that parents had absolute authority over their children and that government interference in family matters was both inappropriate and dangerous to the social order. His patriarchal framework left children like the twins utterly vulnerable, with no legal recourse against their captors. Local law enforcement agencies, understaffed and untrained in recognizing the signs of systematic abuse, typically treated domestic violence and child abuse as private family matters that were best handled by clergy or community leaders rather than the criminal justice system. Sheriffs and deputies, often personally acquainted with families like the Callahans, were reluctant to challenge respected community figures, especially when no one else raised concerns. Clergy, too, prioritized family unity over individual safety, counseling submission rather than intervention. This combination of medical, legal, and social factors had created an environment in which the Callahan twins could disappear without triggering any of the protective mechanisms that modern society takes for granted, their existence erased by a culture that valued appearances over humanity and silence over justice. The fate of the key players in the Callahan tragedy reflected the complex moral and legal questions raised by their crimes, with outcomes that satisfied neither advocates for harsh punishment nor those who believed in the possibility of redemption and rehabilitation. Jeremiah Callahan was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole, dying in the Tennessee State Penitentiary in 1978 after suffering a stroke that left him partially paralyzed and unable to speak, an irony that was not lost on advocates for the twins, who pointed out that his final years had been marked by the same kind of physical helplessness and dependence on others that he had imposed on his own children. Martha Callahan received a slightly lighter sentence due to her cooperation with investigators and evidence that she had been a victim of domestic violence as well as a perpetrator of child abuse, but she never adapted to prison life and died by suicide in 1971, leaving behind a confession that provided additional details about the daily routine of the twins' captivity, but offered no explanation for how she had justified her participation in their abuse. Dr. Wickham's plea agreement allowed him to avoid prison in exchange for surrendering his medical license and providing testimony against other members of the conspiracy, but public pressure eventually forced him to leave Tennessee entirely, and he died in obscurity in Florida in 1982, reportedly suffering from dementia that his family claimed was divine punishment for his crimes. Thomas Mitchell won a Pulitzer Prize for his investigative reporting on the case, but the psychological toll of uncovering such systematic cruelty led him to leave journalism entirely, and he spent his later years working as a social worker specializing in cases involving disabled children. Mary Catherine Sullivan lived to see justice for the twins, but she never forgave herself for not doing more to help them during her brief time at the Callahan farm, spending the rest of her life volunteering with organizations that provided services to abuse survivors and disabled individuals. The moral legacy of the Callahan twins case extends far beyond the specific crimes committed by their captors, raising fundamental questions about the nature of human dignity, the responsibilities of communities to protect their most vulnerable members, and the ways in which social attitudes can transform individual cruelty into systematic oppression. The case became a catalyst for reform in multiple areas of law and social policy, leading to stronger protections for disabled individuals, mandatory reporting requirements for suspected child abuse, and new oversight mechanisms designed to prevent families from completely isolating vulnerable members from outside contact. But perhaps more importantly, the case forced American society to confront uncomfortable truths about its treatment of disabled individuals and the ways in which prejudice and fear could create conditions that made abuse not just possible, but predictable. The twins themselves, after years of rehabilitation and medical treatment, were eventually able to live semi-independently in a group home setting. But their decades of isolation had left them permanently damaged in ways that no amount of therapeutic intervention could completely repair. They never learned to navigate normal social relationships, never developed the communication skills necessary to fully express their experiences, and never overcame the deep psychological trauma inflicted by a lifetime of captivity. Their story became a powerful argument for the importance of early intervention in cases of child abuse and neglect, demonstrating that even the most resilient human beings can be permanently damaged by prolonged isolation and systematic cruelty. The case also highlighted the crucial role that ordinary citizens can play in exposing institutional failures and protecting vulnerable individuals, showing that the courage of people like Mary, Catherine Sullivan and Thomas Mitchell can make the difference between justice and perpetual victimization. Could a tragedy like the Callahan case, where twins endured 40 years of captivity in a Tennessee barn's hidden chamber, happen today? Despite modern child protection, disability services, and mandatory reporting, do blind spots persist, allowing powerful families to silence witnesses and control narratives in isolated communities? The twins' suffering, buried by a society that ignored their existence, ended only because one reporter rejected easy answers and one woman clung to haunting memories of sounds beneath the barn. What warning signs must we heed? What questions should we ask when a family's story feels wrong? Next week, Shadow Stories probes the Hartwell children case, where parents hid 12 missing children behind lies of special schools, masking a sinister truth. Keep questioning official narratives, listen to whispers others dismiss, and remember, the most monstrous crimes often hide behind respectable facades. Share your thoughts below. See you in the shadows.